So my introduction to you was through your book, Searching for Black Confederates. And I didn't know about the book at all. I read an article, an interview of you with Rebecca Onion, I believe, and it was called The Myth of Black Confederates.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh my God, I couldn't believe it. Because I'd heard, like, for real, I think my great uncle, he was a Confederate lieutenant general or something, Thomas Lafayette Rosser, and yeah, so a local group, there's a gentleman that worked in our school district. He passed away, but he was part of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and he asked me if I'd speak on him, and I'm like, I don't know enough about him, So anyway, but that was my the whole thing with the Lost Cause is it made me rethink everything that I had previously learned. Yeah. And in that process, I've been a teacher. This will be my 16th year, and we still have Lost Cause stuff in our curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I was teaching in Virginia, I did a lot of work with teachers around the states, professional development workshops geared to the Civil War. And I mean, the Lost Cause came up quite a bit. I mean, and it's not surprising because, you don't have to go that far back to find Virginia textbooks for fourth graders and so on that included the Lost Cause narrative going back to the 1960s. And so it's still, depending on how often a school district changes its books, new teachers coming in who are learning new material. I mean, a lot of these factors work in determining whether the Lost Cause is still being taught. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very prominent, and we've had a shift. The change that happened previously, for the longest time, it was the cause of the Civil War was states' rights, and then all of a sudden it shifted to states' rights and some issues regarding slavery.
That's right.
But now they're trying to shift it back just to states' rights. Yeah. So that's all this going on. So what do you have any thoughts or comments on any of that stuff?
Well, I think Virginia is not alone in that, and I think it speaks to competing interests in how we remember and commemorate the Civil War era. It's a reminder that I think how we think about the past has direct influence on the present, right? Whether or not we are willing to talk about certain issues like the history and legacy of slavery, the history and legacy of white supremacy. And so, I think what is, explicit often in these debates is a willingness or fear of taking on these issues, because I think people do understand that they have direct influence on the present politics, who we vote for, who we support. And I think that's a lot about what these debates are focusing on right now. It's not so much, the past per se and what we teach about the past, it's the present, right? Memory is always, debates about historical memory are almost always about the present, right? And how we think about the present. So I'm not surprised at all. And Virginia is far from alone when it comes to these issues.
So I obviously have read the book, and I've read the interviews. I've also read some essays you've contributed to other people's books. But for the students who are going to be watching this, the thing that impressed me the most is that you tie into so much of modern technology, like the internet and social media. Would you be willing to speak on anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the internet has been both a blessing and a curse in my view, in terms of how we think about history, how we teach history, the way in which we do research now. I mean, now we have at our fingertips, we have access to rich databases filled with all kinds of historical evidence that you used to have to spend money to travel to repositories, archives across the country to get your hands on. And now it's just easily accessible. And on the one hand, I think that's wonderful, because we all now have the opportunity to look at this material and interpret it for ourselves. At the same time, however, a lot of this material is difficult to interpret. A lot of this material requires, especially when it comes to the Civil War era, I think a lot of it often requires some kind of background understanding of the relevant history to interpret some of these documents. And so when, for example, picking out an example from my own research and the Black Confederates book, there's a famous photograph of a Confederate soldier and a Black man sitting next to him, both uniformed, both wearing Confederate uniforms. You can find this photograph of Andrew and Silas Chandler on hundreds of websites today. And if you don't know much about the history of the Chandler family, the history of slavery in Mississippi, the history of how the Confederacy itself dealt with slavery and how it utilized the labor of enslaved people, you're going to have difficulty interpreting this photograph. And I think for the uneducated, seeing two men sitting side by side, fully armed, wearing Confederate uniforms, it's almost impossible not to see them as Confederate soldiers. But if you look into the relevant evidence, it becomes very clear very quickly that one of them was, in fact, Andrew was a Confederate soldier in a Mississippi regiment, and the other was his body servant, or what I call camp slave. In other words, from Silas, the Black man, was enslaved to the Chandler family, and like many other Confederates from the slaveholding class, brought his body servant with him into the Army, as thousands of others did. And so again, having that material easily accessible, on the one hand, it allows all of us to be our own historian. On the other hand, it becomes very easy to make crucial mistakes in how we interpret that evidence. And it allows certain myths and certain misunderstandings about the past to thrive online, because of course there are no gatekeepers online. And so if all you're doing to research a subject is plugging in a few keywords to, say, Google or your preferred search engine, if you don't know what you're looking at when you get the results, then you may run into all kinds of problems, all kinds of misperceptions and downright false claims. So it's a challenge.
No, that you hit the nail on the head, because that's one of the things that I've really tried over the past 5 years, is to educate the students on social media in terms of the dangers. And, just even today, like I've seen you on Twitter, well, previously, arguing with people about the, Black Confederates or lost cause issues. And Facebook, even now, I keep getting targeted with these, historical fan sites, like, praise Dixie and this, that, and the other. And it's just, it's unbelievable.
Well, I mean, one of the best examples from Virginia goes back to 2011, where I believe it was a fourth grade textbook, history textbook, was handed out to districts. And a historian, a Civil War historian at William & Mary, whose daughter was just starting the fourth grade, decided to look in the textbook to see what it had to say about the Civil War. And of course, you can imagine her horror when she discovered that there was an entire section devoted to the thousands of Black Confederate soldiers fighting with Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. This is a myth. There were no Black Confederate soldiers with Stonewall Jackson or any other Confederate army before the last days of the Confederacy in March of '65, when the government finally passed legislation authorizing the enlistment of former slaves as soldiers. But of course, the war ends shortly thereafter, and there's no evidence that any of these men saw the battlefield. But when they asked the author of the book where she found this information, you can imagine what she said. She did a Google search, and up came, of course, any number of websites that would have confirmed perhaps a suspicion on her part, or perhaps something she heard about somewhere else. So again, it can be quite a slippery rock. The internet can be quite slippery and dangerous if you don't know how to maneuver through it.
So just one last thing about your book. In one of the later chapters, you mentioned that the Sons of Confederate Veterans had a doctor who confirmed the information, and there's an email address, and you said it didn't exist. I just, out of curiosity, I emailed him. I never got a response.
There you go.
Yeah, just unbelievable. So the lost cause, in terms of, you just kind of spread it out. It's a false narrative. So do you have anything that, you would share to students who've never heard of the lost cause?
Well, I want to sort of just back up one step. I certainly use that language, a false narrative, and certainly other historians and commentators have used that language of a false narrative. But the lost cause, I think, is something much richer than that. It is a narrative that that emerged in the immediate post-war period. So you can imagine, especially in Virginia, in many sections, the Shenandoah Valley, Northern Virginia, between Washington, D.C. And Richmond, these areas were devastated by armies that had been moving through over the last 4 years. And so Confederate defeat, what white civilians of the Confederacy were feeling, was a very strong feeling of defeat. They were reminded of it everywhere they turned, both in terms of the landscape itself, the number of military age men that never came home or had lost limbs or were severely wounded in other ways. And then, of course, the end of slavery. The very institution that the Confederacy was created to preserve is now over. And so defeat loomed large for former Confederates who were trying to make sense of how it was possible, because, of course, they believed in 1861 that their cause was a righteous cause, that God was on their side, and that their military was sufficiently prepared to deal with what everyone understood to be a much better, first of all, much larger population in the North, the United States, and a better equipped, in every way imaginable, army. And yet they are now dealing with defeat. And so the lost cause becomes a narrative to help them make sense of that defeat and allow them to begin to think about how to move forward. And so, as opposed to 1861, when Confederates argued clearly that slavery was their cause, after 1865, former Confederates will argue that, in fact, it was a constitutional dispute that led to secession and war. It was not the issue of slavery, but a disagreement over the Constitution itself, or, as we argue today, it was about states' rights. They will argue that the Confederate population was unified throughout, that there was no internal dissension among Confederates during the war, although, of course, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that there was plenty of dissension. Governors disputing with the federal government in Richmond, with Jefferson Davis and his government, women rioting in Richmond and other parts of the Confederacy over the lack of bread and other, of course, necessities. And then, of course, in the ranks itself, the clear evidence of increased desertion at certain times during the war. And so after the war, former Confederates wanted to make sure that the rest of the world understood that they were united against this Yankee invasion, right? They were the innocent party, and the evil Yankees, of course, came down to destroy their peaceful civilization. I already mentioned, of course, how the argument over slavery changes. But one of the things I tried to emphasize in my book about the Black Confederate myth is that after the war, former Confederates will remain united in asserting that enslaved people did not rebel during the war. They remained loyal to their masters and to the Confederacy until its very last days. And so that allows them to undercut any argument that slavery was an evil, right? That slavery was morally problematic. And then, of course, what lost cause proponents will argue or emphasize is the bravery of the men in the ranks, and especially, of course, the kind of moral righteousness of Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee, like Stonewall Jackson, men who sort of represented, who embodied character, religious character, the Christian virtues, in contrast with United States generals like William Tecumseh Sherman or Ulysses S. Grant, who quickly becomes known as the Butcher, right? In contrast, of course, with Robert E. Lee, much more civilized, the Virginia gentleman to the very end. So that is a way to begin to understand how white Southerners in the years following the Civil War attempt to begin to make sense of what that experience was all about. And so it becomes all about memory. It becomes all about how they chose to remember the war, I think in part to help them move forward, but also to justify the scale of defeat and the scale of death that they had experienced. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the lost cause will evolve over time. What the lost cause looks like in 1865, 1870 will be different from what it looks like by 1900, when the veterans are beginning to die off, the Civil War generation begins to die off, and a new generation, younger generation of white Southerners begins to take their place. And by the early 20th century, this is the period of time in which a lot of the Confederate monuments that we're now debating go up across the South, including Virginia. Think of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, the first one in 1890, the Robert E. Lee, and then, of course, the last one in 1930. So that period of time is really crucial. And the lost cause is that narrative that helps explain why these monuments are going up. And also by that point in time, helps to explain and justify Jim Crow and legalize segregation, right? So history becomes a tool by which white Southerners will justify their racial order by the early 20th century. So I'll stop there just to give you a chance to follow up. Or
you just said so much that just brings back. So for example, I ended up buying Mildred Rutherford's Truths of History, and reading that is mind blowing.
Absolutely.
And then I definitely visited Monument Avenue as well as Charlottesville, the statue that caused all the ruckus more recently. And I interviewed some people, and it's just, you go from one extreme to the other where, you have different people. And the funny thing is, when I was on Monument Avenue, there was another teacher, an African-American gentleman. We talked for like 30 minutes, and he was doing the same thing I was. Yeah. He was this was back maybe in 2019. It was like, these statues are going to come down. So I'm going to get some pictures to be able to show my students what this was all about.
Yeah.
But
I'll just add real fast. I apologize for cutting you off, but you mentioned Mildred Rutherford, and she's absolutely important in all of this, because one of the things that, her organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, understood, and this is really important for teachers and students to understand and appreciate, is that the United Daughters of the Confederacy understood that that controlling the historical narrative was absolutely crucial in educating the younger generations of white Southerners that did not experience the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the UDC, through much of the 20th century, at least the first half, exercised a great deal of control over history textbooks. They wanted to make sure that the history books that students were studying and reading from at different grade levels in Virginia and elsewhere pushed the lost cause narrative. They didn't want books praising President Lincoln or celebrating Union victory in the end of slavery. They wanted a narrative that adhered to that lost cause narrative. And one of the reasons why, getting back to where we started, the beginning of our conversation, one of the reasons why we're still debating these questions about the Civil War and what it was all about is because the UDC had such success in controlling those textbooks.
And just to say, I ended up buying quite a few of them, but the hardest thing for me is I wanted to get curriculum from different stages in Virginia, and it's all been destroyed. They got rid of any traces of it. So I had to actually go on eBay and Amazon and find, various books to get them to be able to show my students, what it actually looked like. And it's just what you described. It's very... Today, even, most of them are like, I can't believe it was like that. And I'm like, I know, but
that's right.
Again,
I mean, you can imagine, when I taught in Virginia, I would show my students, examples from textbooks from the 1960s that were used. And, there would be a chapter on the history of slavery in Virginia. And on the first page of that chapter would be an illustration of a boat with a finely dressed Black family carrying luggage, right? Yeah. Shaking hands with, I guess you assume is their slave owner, their master, and they're about to get off a ship. It looks like they're about to go on a family vacation or something. And this is the image that students are supposed to believe represented the history of slavery. And it's just, yeah, my students just could not believe this. And it's not as if it was 100 years ago, right? It's just a few decades ago, right? And it's a reminder of how close we are to that past.
No, I literally have the book that you just
Yeah,
described, and I have those, not just that picture, but there's several pages, consecutively. I have that, to show my students, and that
yeah,
one always like blows their mind. And
yeah.
there's so many, and that obviously, but it's another thing too. The resurgence of the lost cause ideas. You touched on that briefly, and a lot of it's just political. And
I think
that's
so.
really weird. And it's like, I've seen some of your Twitter battles in the past, not
Yeah,
recently, but yeah, but
yeah.
it's like, I applaud that, you're willing to throw yourself out there and, fight with some of these keyboard warriors.
Yeah, it's still out there. I always like to emphasize that I I think the lost cause, yes, you can still find it out there. I think you can find, especially political leaders, elected leaders, who will embrace it for their own purposes. For example, go back to 2000. I think it's roughly 2016, after the murders in Charleston, South Carolina, at the Black church committed by Dylan Roof, and the removal of the Confederate flag on the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina. And then, of course, that started off a lot of this most recent push to remove Confederate imagery from public places. There was a backlash against that. And I remember two Republican senators, state legislators in South Carolina, arguing that there should be a monument placed on the South Carolina State House grounds honoring the Black Confederates who fought in Confederate ranks. Right now, that is a lost cause, thread, right? A deeply ingrained lost cause thread, but it got nowhere, right? And there have been a few other proposals along those lines since. Those also have really not gotten anywhere. And the point I want to make is, the lost cause is still out there, but it really doesn't have the kind of influence that it had just a few decades ago. And so I think it's important to recognize and even celebrate, to a great extent, that we have come quite far in how we remember the Civil War, emancipation, the tens of thousands of Black United States soldiers that fought during the Civil War. That is a welcome change, and especially how we teach the Civil War. We have issues, there's no question. I think the current debate that's taking place across the country in state legislatures is tough. It's depressing at times, but I think we can safely say that the lost cause has, lost its influence, at least the kind of influence that it used to have.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the last time our curriculum was updated, the words "lost cause" appeared in it for the first time, which was amazing.
Yeah.
But now they want to change things, and it would disappear if that's the case.
Yeah. And look, and even in the most recent round of changes in Virginia curriculum, it's not perfect. These are, by their nature, these are political battles, right? The state boards are appointed by the governor, right? So it's political. There's no way around that. But the latest version, I'm happy to see, includes Confederate General William Mahone, who most Virginians know nothing about. And in my mind, he is, after Thomas Jefferson, probably the most important Virginian of the entire century. Here's a guy who rose in the ranks, the Confederate ranks, to the rank of general by 1865, and after the war was in charge of a huge railroad company that went under financially by the early 1870s. But by the end of the 1870s, had formed a biracial coalition called the Readjusters that controlled Virginia government for 4 years. And during those 4 years, the largest number of Black Virginians are voting. The largest number of Black Virginians are going to school, public schools. Black Virginians are serving in state government and in county governments across the state. It only lasts for a few short years, and I don't want to argue that William Mahone was should be understood as a civil rights leader in any sense, but he absolutely was crucial, and he complicates our understanding of Virginia history, I think, in a really good way, and people should know about him. And so, you can imagine my surprise when I saw his name listed among the people that students should have some knowledge of. I forgot I forgot the grade level, but I think it was high school where he was introduced. But that's encouraging. That's a nice development.
I want to say, did you contribute an essay about him? Because I did include him in my paper, and was blown away when I learned about him. Never heard, but you just
Yeah.
included more information I didn't even know about.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography back in 2005, a journal essay, and then he was included in my first book about the Battle of the Crater. Yeah, and I learned about him completely by chance as a high school teacher who took part in a professional development workshop at the University of Virginia, I think in 2002. And, the professor leading us was Gary Gallagher, a well-known Civil War historian at UVA, and he asked us, has anyone ever heard of William Mahone? And I'd never heard of William Mahone, and I immediately went to the library and picked up the one biography about him that was written in 1935 and was just blown away, and never heard anything along the lines of biracial, political party, anything like that.
No, it's amazing. I've taken up so much of your time, but is there anything that you would like to say to, 16 to 19-year-old kids? I do high school, but I also do dual enrollment. I teach a, 100 level college course. Is there anything just that, you would like to share?
There is so much going on right now in Virginia and other parts of the country about how we think about our past, how we use our public spaces, in places like Richmond, but even in small towns across Virginia and elsewhere, how we use those spaces to not only remember the past and commemorate the past, but how we use those spaces to bring communities together today in 2023. And, perhaps these debates aren't going on in your area, perhaps they are, but take an interest, right? Because these questions are all about the future, right? And so, it's not just about history, or I should say that history becomes a way of thinking about how we want to think of ourselves as members of our local communities, but also as citizens of this country. And so, even if you think these debates aren't worth much of your attention, I think they are. And so I hope you'll pay some attention to them and think about what they're all about.
Well, Mr. Levin, I can't thank you enough. It was been an honor, and I couldn't believe that, you agreed to do this. I just want to say this is hilarious, but my first attempt was just to get some of the local colleges, like, people you've never heard of, so to speak, and just ask them if they would be willing to donate their time. To this date, not one single of them has responded. Yet you and so many other big name history rock stars, they all did. And that's just amazing. And that's why who you are. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. But, anytime I have the opportunity to talk to fellow history teachers, I'm gonna jump at it, because I think what we do in the classroom is the most important work that can be done right now. You're on the front lines. You probably don't get much praise for what you do and thanks for what you do. So I'll say it right now. Thank you for all the work that you do for your students and for your community, because it's really important. So thank you.
Well, again, thank you. I learned more. Not just you, but you changed my life, the way that I think, because like I said, I grew up believing a lot of things that were not true, and it just rearranged everything. And I've just become a better person because of that. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that, Chad. Thanks so much.